Can go live now. Welcome everyone to the second event in the Platypus East Coast Conference. We're very happy to be having an event in person where everybody can come and discuss the history and politics of the left. For our second event, we will be interviewing Jack Clark. In the interview, I think you'll learn a lot more about him, but by way of a very brief introduction, Jack Clark was a member of the anti-war faction of the Young People's Socialist League and a founding member of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee that later became the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And we're very happy that he's agreed to come and tell us about his long experience on the left. Just a bit of information about Platypus. We're an international organization of students dedicated to hosting the conversation on the left about the death of the left, to investigate what potential there is for renewed and new emancipatory politics in the present. So to that end, we run reading groups across the world, and we host events such as this interview, our public fora, and we publish the Platypus Review, which you can find online at platypus1917.org, where we invite activists, academics, intellectuals, and really anybody on the left interested in discussing the question of the history of the left to contribute to this conversation. And we are located on George Mason University campus, as well as across the United States. So afterwards, I think feel free to ask anybody with a platypus pin, and not all of us have them, or me and Justin perhaps, about platypus, and we'll probably tell you about opportunities to get involved in your area. So without further ado, I think we'll start the interview. Here, I'll let you use the mic because I can project very loudly.
And we also have the...
Yeah,
I
and
have
it's,
that too. I actually project pretty well too.
Okay,
great.
I'm privileged to use this.
Okay.
Wonderful. So just to start off, I was wondering if you could tell us about how you became politicized and what your kind of political trajectory on the left was.
Sure. I'm old, so I'm 72 years old. So it means I was born in 1949. So I was shaped by a lot of stuff going on in the early 60s. And it's a funny question about what my trajectory, how I started on the left. And in a funny way, I started on the left when I was in the, I think, 5th or 6th grade of my Catholic elementary school. And the nun talked very movingly about the work that Martin Luther King and the Southern Civil Rights Movement was doing was Jesus' work. And that touched me very deeply. And I remember as a 14-year-old watching the March on Washington and hearing, of course, hearing King's speech, but also a whole array of people really talking about a new world, about a different liberatory politics. And one of the things that struck me, and it's in the current age of Black Lives Matter and the things that, a lot of the white reaction about, they're trying to take our privileges and that kind of thing. One of the things that was very striking about the rhetoric and the whole spirit of that march, and I remember, I think John Lewis probably said this, and a couple of other people said it too, we're looking to win our freedom so we can free you too. And it was very much a message of, we're looking to free people from the burden of racism that you're carrying. We're really looking to free you from all the nonsense that you've been carrying around and the things that are holding you back. And it was a very, that moment in history really touched me very deeply, and I think it really became part of my politics. So later, as I started going through high school and doing more reading and whatnot, it became clear to me that what King was talking about was more than, and he was explicit about it himself, it was more than the freedom to sit at the lunch counter. Because as he and a number of other civil rights leaders pointed out, it didn't do you any good to sit at the lunch counter if you didn't have the money to buy a cup of coffee. And that there needed to be a more just distribution of resources in society. And I think it was only later that I became aware that King explicitly was really advocating democratic socialism, but there was a lot in sort of the atmosphere at that point that was pointing in that direction. So I'd say by the time I finished high school, that had very much shaped me. And I, like a lot of kids, and particularly Catholic kids, probably started out thinking the Vietnam War was a good idea, because it was, we were fighting communism, and there was I think this has probably disappeared from the history a lot, but it was very present at the time that, particularly we're protecting Catholics against the godless communist scourge. And it was somewhat later I came to the realization a lot of the same people who I identified with in the civil rights movement were fighting against the war, and I tried to learn more about that, and really figured out this wasn't a good idea. So by the time I got to college, SDS had sort of fallen apart. I started college in '67, and was sort of just caught up in my freshman year and everything else. But by '68, when I was finding time for politics again, I'd gone to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and what had been a pre-SDS chapter just turned into a mess. And PL had sort of taken over, and there was a RIM, I think there was a RIM 1 and a RIM 2 faction on campus, but it was sort of, nobody wanted to go near it. If you weren't already convinced that you wanted to be in the Progressive Labor Party, you didn't go there. And sometime that year, somebody that I knew somewhat, who actually lived in my dorm, started a chapter of the Young People's Socialist League, and I joined. And it was after I joined the Young People's Socialist League that I figured out I had made a mistake. And it was because Michael Harrington was the chair of the Socialist Party. Bayard Rustin, who was the leading figure in organizing the 1963 March on Washington, was a prominent figure in that whole world. And it looked like a sane version of left politics that would, of course, be anti-war. And it was, and I'm saying I made a mistake. I think there was also a period where the politics that they really had were not evident. And what happened is, over time, it became more evident. And it turned out that the majority grouping within YPSL, and a very substantial faction within the Socialist Party, had really decided they were pro-war. You probably know the name Mack Shackman, or if you don't, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He was a very prominent leader of the left for a long time. At a very young age, he had become a leader of the American Communist Party. I believe his parents were Russian-speaking, so he was already immersed in the revolution very early on. And to his dying day, he would tell you that the Bolshevik Revolution was the most democratic movement in mass movement in world history. And I had the sort of weird experience of hearing him speak a couple of times. He was a brilliant Marxist orator. And he was able to give you a long dissertation, including that assertion about the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution being the most democratic movement in world history. And his speeches tended to be, his short speeches went 2 or 3 hours. It was a tradition that a number of, so I guess Fidel Castro had that tradition also, just giving really endless speeches, but Max definitely did that. But he would deliver a 2-hour speech, which was actually spellbinding. He was a brilliant orator who held people's attention. But he would conclude his speech by trying to convince you that the victory of the U.S. forces over the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army was a dialectical necessity in world history. And he had people following who believed that. And by the time some of this was playing out, I joined, and I can't say that initially I was a leader in this grouping, but I joined the anti-war faction of the YPSL and the Socialist Party. And I think in the IPSL we were probably a little ahead of where Mike Harrington was in the Socialist Party. We were in opposition a little bit earlier than he on this. But by, I think, 71, Mike had come out publicly saying, you know, this is ridiculous. We have to be for full and unilateral withdrawal from Vietnam. And we know that's going to lead to a communist victory. That's not a good outcome. But it's better than continuing this bloodshed. And it's better than alternatives. Shackman and his followers did not believe that. They believed it was important to continue fighting. In 72, in the election with McGovern and Nixon, the people around Max, and Max actually died just a little bit before the election, but the people around him played a very prominent role in convincing the leadership of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, and the people, Lane Kirkland, and the people directly around them, that neutrality in the election between Nixon and McGovern was a good idea. But it wasn't really neutrality, it was really a pro-Nixon move, and everybody understood it as that, including Meany. And Meany gave a very disingenuous press conference where he said, I wish Norman Thomas were still around. And of course, Meany was old enough to have supported Norman Thomas a number of times, and he never did. And for those of you who don't know, Norman Thomas was the leader of the Socialist Party for a number of years, and I believe he was presidential candidate, I forget whether it was 5 or 6 times, starting in 28 and ending in 48. So that grouping became very entrenched. They won the various faction fights in the Socialist Party, and the IPSL we lost. And Mike Harrington was really the figure we were rallying around, who had, you know, saying enough on this. And besides the immediate issue of the war, there were a whole set of related issues. And Meany really became sort of the symbol of those issues in a lot of ways, not by our choosing, but by our Socialist Party's opponents' choosing. And they really sort of made it a test of socialist integrity, that you were fully for the elected leadership of the AFL-CIO, or else you were not supporting the working class. And it was stated in pretty much almost that crude a level of
right.
So after the election, the Socialist Party had its 1972 convention in December of 72. Harry Fleischman, whom I remember very fondly and who was very close to Norman Thomas, had been National Secretary of the Socialist Party and managed a couple of Thomas's presidential campaigns, rose at the beginning of that convention to change the orders of the day, to say that we need to amend the agenda so we can immediately pass a resolution condemning the terror bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, which was going on as we met. He was laughed off the floor. We were defeated very badly. It was a shameful moment, in my opinion. By the end of that convention, Socialist Party USA had renamed itself Social Democrats USA. And we didn't leave at that point. Mike was very clear that we weren't walking out at that point, that we were weighing our options and seeing what happened. But within a year, we had formed a new organization and took on a name that was self-consciously modest. It was a member of ours who had been involved in the labor movement for years suggested we adopt the nomenclature from the Congress of Industrial Organizing Committee, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and call ourselves an organizing committee rather than an organization, rather than a formed organization. So we became the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And in October of 1973, we held our founding convention. By that time, and actually sort of tracing back on where I was personally, I was available because I had graduated from college and I hadn't started a graduate program or sort of real career. I was a cub reporter for a small city daily just outside Boston, and I was asked to move to New York to start organizing initially for the coalition caucus of the Socialist Party, and I moved down in October of '72. By October of '73, we had had the founding convention of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. So that's some of my background.
Thank you. I know Justin's going to have a question about the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, but before we ask that question, I was wondering, because the Socialist Party had many disagreements and fights, long before 1972. But what do you think it was about 1972 and kind of, I don't know, the convalescence of Vietnam, but also the McGovern campaign and these issues that made it kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, that caused the Socialist Party to split three ways?
Well, a few things on that in terms of the Socialist Party's history. A lot of the disagreements they had, the Socialist Party didn't go through, in some ways, formal splits on some of their earlier disagreements, but they went through a hemorrhaging of membership and influence. So the comparable period that I'd look at in the Socialist Party where the Socialist Party got hurt very badly was on the opposite side with the anti-war question, where Thomas, who was a very principled pacifist, and he had really ceased being a pacifist around the time of the Spanish Civil War, but he, given the awful experience of World War I, and given that in the Spanish Civil War, nobody rallied to the side of the Spanish Republicans and said, we're going to resist the Nazis there. We're bombing civilians. And Mussolini and Hitler were very openly supporting Franco's forces and overthrowing a democratically elected government that had genuine mass support. So Thomas was extremely disillusioned and cynical about what the West's motives actually were. And he took that further than it could be taken, could be justifiably taken, and really opposed U.S. entry into World War II. At that point, the Socialist Party, and actually for a few years before that, and I'd go back to the 1936 election, which Thomas ran for president against FDR. But the 1936 election was, I think, by any reasonable reckoning in American history, a class-aligned election. Roosevelt won the support of the working class and made it clear that, the whole thing about I'm running against the economic royalists, and his famous Madison Square Garden speech where he starts talking about really the corporate ruling class and ends his speech with, they hate me and I welcome the hatred. And so you had people like David Dubinsky and Sidney Hillman, the head of the ILGWU and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, respectively, who were, up to that point, really active members of the Socialist Party. And not only were they members of the Socialist Party, their members were members of the Socialist Party. In places like the Bronx and Brooklyn, the Socialist Party, a good friend of mine who grew up in the Bronx, recalled when he was a kid that nobody heard of any Republicans, that Democrats would win consistently in the Bronx and the Socialist Party would come in second. And that was true in a lot of working class precincts in New York. But in 1936, that ended. And in 1936, the organized working class in the needle trades, which had been the base of what was an organized mass industrial union movement at that point, that they and the mine workers are their own history, but the textile workers, the clothing workers, the men's clothing workers in the Amalgamated, women's clothing workers in the ILGWU, in mass left the Socialist Party, and the leaders left at the same time, and it was over a split in the election. By 1940, substantial numbers of people were still around, but they left. Leonard Woodcock, who ended up becoming a leader of the UAW, was a loyal member of the Socialist Party up until that point and just felt he couldn't stay any longer. And there were others who followed that same route. So the Socialist Party didn't have the same splits you had in '72, but what you had is people walking away. And in fact, in that period from '36 to the early '40s, nobody treats it as a split, as an organization that came out of that split, but the decline of the Socialist Party led directly to the formation of Americans for Democratic Action. And a lot of the people, Reinhold Niebuhr being a very prominent example, who had been prominent Socialist Party leaders, and these same people in the needle trades, and the Ruther brothers and others in the emerging CIO, who might have, in other circumstances, been leading voices in an organized socialist movement, organized the mass liberal movement. So I think '72, there were a lot of things about '72 that were unique, but the history and the damage to the Socialist Party was, the Socialist Party was a much smaller organization by '72 than it had been even in 1940. So it was, you were dealing in a much smaller frame, but the combination of the split over the war, the major split over an election. Mike published an open letter in the New York Times lamenting that in 1972 the Socialist Party of Debs and Thomas was doing the work of Richard Nixon, which was a pretty harsh indictment, but I think it was accurate. And under those kinds of circumstances, you split.
Right. So one question I wanted to ask you is, you know, in a previous Platypus panel you had been on, you mentioned the realignment strategy.
Right.
So I believe that was leading up to the McGovern campaign, right? Or in the middle?
It was, but the realignment strategy goes back a lot further than that.
You said to the 50s.
And I actually mentioned Shackman earlier. So Shackman had been, as I mentioned, a major leader in the Communist Party in his youth. He had, by the late 20s, become one of the two major leaders of American Trotskyism. And then he and Cannon split over the Soviet invasion of Finland in 1940. And it was, because Shackman said it was not justified, Cannon said it was justified, so the Orthodox Trotskyist movement was saying it's still a justified action by a corrupted worker state, but it's still, and Shackman by that point no longer thought that the Soviet Union was a corrupted worker state. He thought it was beyond being a deformed worker state, that it was a new class society built on a bureaucratic elite. But Shackman remained an independent leftist for a long time, and part of that history in the Socialist Party between 36 and 40 is that Shackman and Cannon entered.
Right.
So that they, if you know your left history in Europe, they executed what they called the French turn, which is what the Trotskyists resulted in France, is we're entering the mass social democratic movement. And what they did is I don't like the term Trotskyist wreckers, but in this case they were Trotskyist wreckers. They came in and sort of recruited a lot of people from the IPSL into their own faction, and left the Socialist Party a shambles. And Trotsky apparently was very approving of this, of the fact that they left the Socialist Party a shambles, which, you know, you're eliminating a competitor. It was very destructive, bad stuff. But by the mid-50s, Shackman had reconsidered a lot of his politics. And I've got some friends who remind me of this every time we get frustrated with some of the sectarianism currently in DSA, that a lot of people who I respect now, who've shown really good political judgment, did things that would regard as sort of silly or stupid or even retrograde when they were much younger. So an example of this, Shackman's organization, which at that point was called the Independent Socialist League, had a policy that will never support a bourgeois democratic candidate, because the bourgeois party will never do that. So you had people, they actually had some real membership in Chicago. including a substantial number of people in the UAW, some people in the packing house workers, some teachers, some others. And they had a little bit of a relationship with some left-wingers in the black community. A friend of mine recently recounted to me that she remembers in her youth, when she was in the ISL, a black shop steward from the UAW ran for I think at the time they were called aldermen in Chicago. I think they may be called city councils now, but at the time they were called aldermen.
They're still aldermen in
They're still
Chicago.
aldermen. Okay. So he ran in the Democratic Party in the Democratic primary for the position of alderman. The ISL supported him because he was an insurgent candidate. He actually won the primary, and they decided they couldn't support him anymore. Because he was running as the candidate of a bourgeois party. So you got into stuff like that, which was just silly. And by the mid-50s, there was a lot of rethinking of that. And at that point, it wasn't Shackman alone, but a lot of people came to the conclusion there could be a major, you could be doing a lot to realign American politics. So in the narrow world of the left, one of the things that happened that was enormously important is Khrushchev's 20th Congress speech in '56, I believe it was an earthquake in the world communist movement and very much in the American communist movement. And lots of people sort of turned around and said, there were a number of Jews who had been very pro-Stalin because they believed the party line that we're eliminating racism here, and this Khrushchev's 20th Party speech made it clear that Stalin's Communist Party was rotten with anti-Semitism, and that in the end of his life, the Doctor's Plot was a specific attempt to try to root out Jews, and it was just awful, awful stuff. And people who had devoted their lives to this turned around and said, I believe the lie. And they were breaking from the Communist Party and not sure where to go. And the Gates faction of the Communist Party was the biggest group of that. And they were leaving. So in a small world of the left, that was a big deal. And Shackman was paying attention to it. And in the larger world of American politics, the Montgomery Bus Boycott had already happened. The U.S. Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education had happened in '54. It looked like there was a potential break in American politics around race, where you could really get some things done in politics if you could isolate the Dixiecrats and pull together the people, the CIO-supported candidates in the North and others, and the old urban machines. Some of them were still around, but a lot of the corruption that was associated with the old urban machines had also just sort of, a lot of it had decayed away at that point. It was still there, but not as strong, Chicago being the exception. But there was a lot of change. So there was a lot of hope. And I mentioned ADA earlier. ADA was very much part of that hope, that you could have a realignment, isolating the Dixiecrats, having a principled liberal left party that would be united on things like civil rights and labor rights, and that it would change American politics. At the same time, Shackman, the Gates faction, and a number of other people thought that, well, you could also have a realignment on the left who bring together a lot of people who hadn't always gotten along. And at that point, Thomas, to his enormous credit, was willing to accept Shackman's good faith that he'd come back into the Socialist Party and not play the same role. And he did. And the ISL group did. Mike Harrington was part of that group. Bogdan Denich was part of that group. Debbie Meyer was part of that group. A lot of people who were very influential founders in DSOC were part of that group. They came in, but the real hope at that point was that the ISL could come in, Thomas's Socialist Party, which still had a sterling reputation, because Norman Thomas had such a sterling reputation. And for all his mistakes, he did wonderful things. I mean, he was really, I think, somebody may have different information on this, and I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Thomas was, I believe, the only prominent American who stood up to say that the internment of the Japanese was wrong. So he, for whatever political mistakes, he was a moral giant, and everybody recognized that. So there'd been a hope that Thomas's Socialist Party could be the gathering point for a realignment of the left that would be part of a larger realignment of American politics. And it really was that civil rights-driven, labor-driven hope of forming a consistent left liberal party. Now, in fairness, I think even by '72, I think Shackman and his followers would say they still believed that. But there you get it. I mentioned earlier some of the other issues that it wasn't just the war. You got into a lot of issues of social analysis and class analysis and what exactly is going on. And I mentioned that sort of fealty to George Meany's leadership in the AFL-CIO became really a touch point of you had to be there to be really a socialist in the view of the people who followed Shackman. But that also translated into, what do you think of the large middle class movements? And remember, I'm a baby boomer. We're a very large portion of the population. You guys are continuing a trend that we started with really mass higher education. And our generation was an early part of that. So you have people who are on or recently from college campuses who are expressing liberal left politics. And what do you think of them? And what do you think of them as a force in society? What do you think of the anti-war movement, for example? What do you think of the people who were out there in 1970 electing anti-war candidates to oppose Nixon's war? And the fights around that really became as bitter as the fights around the war itself, because Shackman and his followers, Tom Kahn, who at the time was the executive director of the League for Industrial Democracy and became Meany's chief speechwriter and ultimately became head of the AFL-CIO foreign policy apparatus, was the most prominent of the people espousing this line. It really became, it became pretty close to they're the class enemy, because they don't show fealty to the leadership of the AFL-CIO. They were on the wrong side, and we have to oppose that new politics trend. Mike was very clear that he was very hopeful about the large numbers of people coming out of higher education and the politics that a number of us had, and he saw that as fertile ground for change in American politics. And really, if you decide those people are your enemy, there's not a lot of room for dialogue.
Right. So building off of that, you had mentioned earlier, and you'd also mentioned in a previous panel, that you guys wanted to take advantage of fresh social forces. You guys had said to kind of break up this stultifying, Meany domination, I guess, of the AFL-CIO, and try to realign the party towards a more liberal, democratic direction. So what were those social forces exactly? You know, you had mentioned, I think, the civil rights movement. I think you had also mentioned the SP was kind of iffy on feminism at the time in the 60s.
I'd go beyond iffy. Okay. They were very proud of a New York Times piece that ran probably in '71, which was very awfully late for this kind of thing to be running, where Midge Decter, who became a very prominent neoconservative just a few years later, ran a forum. The SP, I think the SP itself, it might have been the LID, but I think the SP itself ran it, where she sort of ran down feminism as being a series of trivial concerns. And they were very proud of getting a piece in the New York Times about that. So they were beyond iffy, they were bad. Right. And I have to say that some of us still had a lot to learn at that point. I think all of us always have a lot to learn on these points. But a lot of process questions and sort of sensitivity to things like having that very common on the left right now, where you have a list of speakers, but it's weighted towards, if you get 5 men and 2 women, the women speak first. That's the kind of thing that wouldn't have occurred to us in the early 70s. But it should have. But the SP was much, much worse on that. So feminism was not something they were great on. The environmental movement was really emerging at that point as a very serious force. I don't think any of us paid as much attention to that as we needed to. But again, the leadership of Social Democrats USA was just bad on it. Because if the building trades wanted something and you were against it, you were on the wrong side of the class divide. And the building trades often wanted, then and now, often want things that are just terrible. As far as they're concerned, build the pipelines with the heavy sludge that goes right under the water sources for Native American indigenous people, and that's just fine. And it's not fine. And it's,
So you guys have this new kind of coalition, I guess, around like the discontents of, say, the SP's bad take on feminism, and then the civil rights movement. And you had mentioned the educated and then also environmentalists. And you guys are going to realign the party, basically, through isolating the Dixiecrats.
Right. And I think the Social Democrats believed in isolating the Dixiecrats, too. And they famously, they were ham-handed on almost everything they did. But famously, in 1971, one of their people suggested a campaign that they thought would be a unifying campaign. So, and the unifying campaign was, we're going to isolate and shame J. William Fulbright, because he's a known racist and Dixiecrat and everything else, which was true. But Fulbright was also, already at that point, the leading Senate critic of the war in Vietnam. And as head of the Foreign Relations Committee, an extremely influential person. So their attempt to come up with a unifying theme was phony. It was crap. But they did believe in, we want to isolate the Democrats and have Dixiecrats and have a realigned party. But their model, and they actually stated this openly, they had something called the Coalition for Democratic Majority. And they put out a couple of manifestos on that. And their model was, let's get away from the McGovern reforms that led to who actually got to be delegates to the 1970 convention that had affirmative action, nothing's built in. And let's have a party that's structured like the British Labour Party, which is constituency based, and the AFL-CIO would have 13 million votes in that party. And it would be George Meany casting those 13 million votes, not even the individual affiliates. And then the NAACP will have a constituent, and they'll have X number of votes, and that's the way it would be structured. So they said they believed, and I think they did believe that you needed a different kind of party, and that's the way it would emerge. But their entire energy went to fighting the middle class reformers who were still active in the party. And on the educated versus the so-called new class and whatnot, the lines on this got very comically funny at times. Because the most prominent, besides Meany himself, who would never have been identified under any circumstances as a socialist, but they sort of adopted him as a socialist. The most prominent union leader that the Social Democrats USA had, who was really throwing very serious organizational support behind them, was Albert Shanker. And of course, Shanker represented teachers. So we're having this sort of weird debate saying, our side saying, well, educated workers and the new middle class, that's a good thing in American politics. And SDUSA is saying, no, it's not. And we have to fall in the traditional working class, but their biggest organizational support was the American Federation of Teachers. So and on our side, the biggest organizational support we had in the American labor movement starting out was the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, which represents a wide range of people, but a lot of them are the people who, the county or city people out there plugging potholes, very blue collar, tending bridges, all that kind of stuff. So there was some sense of unreality in that debate too.
Yeah, I want to get at what is meant by organizing new social forces. I mean, it seems that what you're outlining is that both USA and the people kind of around DSOC want to somehow realign politics, but they kind of have different groups of people that they're going to do it with. And so what does it mean to harness new social forces? And how does this relate to the history of the left and, you know, Marxist ideas of class struggle and things like that? I mean, I know that in DSOC you all were influenced, at least to a certain degree, also by the history of the Communist Party and kind of the 30s and the 40s, that's where the name comes from. And I wonder if there are kind of antecedent strategies on the left that you think where you all were repeating in a certain way or looking to as kind of a model. And then how does organizing new forces relate to class struggle?
Sure. Okay, so when we're talking about, our side was more favorable towards educated, rising middle class forces and that kind of thing. Tom Kahn would have said that we were just anti-working class and that wasn't true. So, and we very much related to all sorts of currents in the American labor movement and saw the difference between us and the SDs on that was extreme, but they tended to overstate it as we were really an anti-labor tendency, which was never true. And we identified very much with a CIO tradition, and a number of people in the UAW who I indicated, you know, Woodcock was one example, but Victor Ruther, Walter's brother, who had been head of the Foreign International Affairs Department of the UAW and of the CIO, was a very early member of ours. Ralph Hellstein, who had been president of the Packing House Workers, joined very early. Not long after that, the Machinists Union became very closely affiliated with us. So we had a lot of people who were part of the working class, who were part of it. A lot of our activities were also very aligned to labor struggles and labor support and all that kind of stuff. So the clothing textile workers, again, historically very much a social stronghold. Clothing textile workers became very closely associated with us, and work on the Stevens boycott became a big part of what we did in terms of trying to keep people from using J.P. Stevens linens and picketing hotels. And one of the things that became a very big thing for us, and we actually had some influence on how this played out, is doing corporate campaigns, which you'd start to isolate. You're not just going after Stevens, but you'd figure out who's on their board of directors. And let's go after the people on the board of directors and do power mapping and figure out who you can isolate and who you can force to do something decent there. So I would argue that's part of class struggle, and I think actually the guy who led that for the amalgamated clothing textile workers is somebody I introduced to the labor movement, a guy named Ray Rogers, who did a brilliant job of doing a lot of that corporate campaigning. So we were very much involved in a lot of struggles. But to the question about how does that manifest itself, let me start in the 70s and then flip back to the 30s.
Okay.
Great. So in the 70s, I mentioned the Coalition for Democratic Majority. And I mentioned the concept they had in Penn Kimball, who was one of the SD crowd, actually led that operation. And they made a major push to push back all the McGovern reforms and all the stuff about affirmative action and everything else. And they ended up in the National Democratic Committee and Democratic Party high councils. They ended up winning an ally in Bob Strauss, who was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee at the time, and a very connected Washington power player. And he sort of was leaning very much towards their side. And to illustrate how the different social forces work and how this worked on our side, they pushed really hard, and they pushed too hard. And at one point, because they wanted to get rid of affirmative action, and because they wanted to get rid of all those kinds of provisions, Jesse Jackson made a statement to the press saying, if they do that, we're going to walk out of the Democratic Midterm Convention. Bob Strauss was asked about that. And again, Strauss is really acting at this point as an ally of the Coalition for Democratic Majority, and really an ally of those Shackman forces from SD-USA. And Strauss says to the press, because he thinks he's being clever, if they want to walk out, I'll get them bicycles. And within a day, that comment had exploded in his face. And what happened is that Leonard Woodcock, who was at the time president of the UAW, intervened, and the UAW, the machinists who had been, the machinists, by the way, I mentioned them in passing, but they had not traditionally been all that left-wing a union, but they were very clear in the 1972 election which side they were on, and they were not happy about being neutral. So that already made them a little bit more friendly towards us. The communications workers had very substantial numbers of people involved in the Democratic National Committee. National Education Association did. But UAW at the time was a much larger union and a much more powerful union than it is now. Woodcock steps in, and he's also not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, which is very important in this context, and says, Bob Strauss has to back off. And the Democratic Midterm Convention, which doesn't exist anymore but had been part of the Democratic reforms, comes together in '74 in Kansas City, and the efforts by the Meany forces, Strauss, and the Coalition for Democratic Majority just collapse. And the reforms to have affirmative action and the, what Tom Kahn and Penn Campbell would call concessions to new class dilettantes was, all of that was allowed because, and in part because of the social forces we were talking about, because Woodcock clearly understood that you couldn't keep going in the Democratic Party and have a majority party that was going to go anyplace if you were angering organized blacks. You certainly couldn't do it if you were deciding to shut down ferment that was coming from the feminist community. So the analysis that we had in our little petri dish of the left on this exploded into a much larger Democratic Party councils. Back to how this plays out in the, you're right, we were very consciously looking at the 30s. And again, looking at Norman Thomas, and I can't overstate how much this was important. Thomas made mistake after mistake in the 30s, and the analysis that a number of us had is Thomas kept making mistakes by being too left-wing, and by saying, well, we're going to be the real militants here, and people say FDR is carrying out our program, he's carrying out in a stretcher, Thomas famously said. And he said that before the 36 election. The organized working class didn't agree with him.
Right.
And what happened, and 36, it was impermissible to support Roosevelt. 38, which is a really important point in terms of the Socialist Party's decline. 37, you have the sit-down strikes in Flint, which establish the UAW, GM gives. And an important turning point in that, which is unprecedented in American history up to this point, is that neither the state nor federal government come in with troops to break the strike. Frank Murphy was governor of Michigan, and there was enormous pressure from the business community for him to call up the National Guard and break the strike, and he refused to do it. Frank Murphy runs for re-election in 1938. The Socialist Party of Michigan comes out with, and this sounds like what I talked about with the Shackmanites in the 1950s, but it was much bigger consequences and much harder politics. Socialist Party of Michigan comes out and says it's impermissible to support Frank Murphy. Walter Reuther leads what had been called the Socialist Action Caucus in the UAW, which was an affiliate of the Socialist Party. The entire caucus leaves the Socialist Party because they just decided this is insanity. In the meantime, the Communist Party, which has gone through a lot of twists and turns of its own, but by 36 has come out of the third period, come out of social fascism is the real enemy and everything else. And it is in the middle of the Popular Front. And Browder positions the Communist Party, and not just Browder, but masses of communists position the Communist Party as, we're on your side, we're for the CIO, we're for the New Deal, and we want to take it further. And the Communist Party enjoys the most successful period of growth in its history, from 36 until, well, 1940. They run into some problems because they support the Hitler-Stalin Pact, 39 actually. But even past that, the Popular Front continues with enormous popularity. So Mike Harrington used to joke that we're the last Browderites. And that was very much more what we were looking at.
Go on.
You know, I'm struck by this story that it seems as though in all of these kind of disagreements on the left, both sides can claim to be representing workers, and there's truth to it, kind of in every case.
Yep.
And that, you know, thinking of the, it's kind of funny to think about Browder next to the McGovern campaign, because, of course, okay, maybe Browder in supporting the New Deal would have had the support of much of, you know, the organized working class. But what else was passed with the New Deal? Well, Jim Crow laws.
Right.
And so then suddenly it's the black working class who's clearly not benefiting from this. And, you know, many people in unorganized parts of the working class, probably in the South especially. Then fast forward to the McGovern campaign, and it seems as though, okay, well, now we're representing this other section of the working class, you know, maybe section of the working class that might benefit from something like affirmative action against the section of the working class that's being organized by George Meany. And so in both cases, it seems as though the communists or the socialists and the leftists are really backed into a corner of representing one side of a disagreement and a fight within the working class itself.
Yep.
And so then one wonders, like, okay, you know, I'm a student who read Marx because I'm interested in the revolution, and, you know, he has some idea about a universal interest of the proletariat, and that the revolution would be carried out in the interest of all the workers. And so kind of what happens to them?
Let's go back to black workers in the 30s. Because you're right, the New Deal didn't so much pass Jim Crow as carry on Jim Crow. The Jim Crow traditions and everything were there, and Roosevelt decided in some cases to look the other way, or in some cases just empower people who he knew were going to carry out terrible policies. So the administration of these programs was left to state officials who were clearly going to practice racism. But in terms of the black working class, and the communists were actually really good on this. In steel, in auto, I mentioned Ralph Hellstein from the packing house workers. Packing house, which is a terrible, dirty, awful, soul-grinding job, and it's also a back-breaking job. You go back to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. But for all sorts of reasons, that was one of the places where black workers got a chance. But the CIO changed the conditions of that. So Hellstein was a real hero in this. Black and white workers came together in those packing houses and formed a joint union. In the steel industry, in the auto industry, black workers rose with that. I mean, the auto industry was a really interesting case because Henry Ford had a long history of supporting a lot of black churches and all sorts of stuff. When the UAW finally cracked Ford Auto and got Local 600, which became the biggest local UAW had a huge militant black leadership. So there were all sorts of that. And then I mentioned Thomas, and he's a complicated figure, but there are even some histories of the labor movement in this period who signal this out. One of the things Thomas was doing, which didn't get very much attention, but he was actually very active in supporting the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was an interracial effort to try to break the power of Jim Crow in the South and try to break the sharecropping system. And it was a heroic effort, And without this other tenant farmers union, probably never would have had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, because that really formed the basis of it. Another socialist who remained a member of the Socialist Party, I think for his entire life, who played an enormously influential role in this, Philip Randolph. And when the war mobilization started, basically everything was war. Once the mobilization started, the entire economy was going to be a war-oriented economy because it just needed to be. And that is in fact how we beat Hitler. Randolph said, well, you can't do this and practice Jim Crow. FDR said, Randolph said, we're going to have a march on Washington. And the march on Washington in '63, Philip Randolph was the grand marshal of it because the March on Washington movement started in the early 40s and ended up having tens of thousands of blacks and some white allies promising to march on Washington to protest racism. FDR and his advisors sort of turned around saying, the public relations in this won't be good because we're saying we're fighting a war against Hitler because he's a monstrous racist, and he is. But if we have a mass demonstration of blacks saying we're being discriminated against, it's not going to work for us. So Randolph really put the squeeze on, and he had some white allies, including some major union leaders, working with him. And it's because of the twists and turns of the Comintern. At some points he had very strong communist support, and at some points the CP was accusing him of being a Nazi agent. But he did have some very strong support. Roosevelt eventually issued an executive order and created a Fair Employment Practices Commission. And the Fair Employment Practices Commission basically said, if you're involved in wartime production, you can't discriminate. Everybody was involved in wartime production. So it was an enormous, the New Deal absolutely carried on and did some terrible racist things, but the dynamic and the dialectic on this was really complicated.
So you had mentioned these new social forces are kind of arising to influence kind of a new coalition to influence the left wing of the New Deal. You had mentioned that in the panel you had done for Platypus before. My question is, perhaps in a response to Norman Thomas, what is the ends of that realignment? Is it just to influence the left wing of the New Deal? How does that relate to the struggle for socialism, as perhaps Norman Thomas would push back on?
I think, well, Thomas was very much for realignment by the 50s too. So I think for Thomas, for Mike Harrington, for a lot of us, the hope really was that by the time you had a realigned party system, you'd have something that would look a little bit like the British Labour Party or a number of the social democratic parties in Europe, as a consistent force for social progress, anti-racism, pro-feminism, environment, strengthening the working class. And that if you could slough off that Dixiecrat wing, that there'd be a possibility of doing that.
I'd like to ask, kind of related to that, I think, how you conceived of the relationship of what you were doing, both in Socialist Party but also in DSOC, to kind of the deeper history of the left and the international history of the left, and particularly the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution, but also before the mass socialist parties of the 19th century, just because we've been talking a lot about Norman Thomas and the Communist Party. Was that history, you brought it up at the very beginning with Mack Shackman, did you think that history influenced what you did, that it gave you some sort of lesson about what you ought to do, or did you feel as though it wasn't?
No, I think we tried to study that history, to learn from that history, and to try to avoid mistakes of that history. Obviously, everybody who currently thinks of herself or himself as a socialist, to some extent, harkens back to that 19th century movement, which had such promise. And you had Irving Howe gave a wonderful speech about this at, I think, our second DSOC convention. And you have people who had been marginalized and exploited and found their voice and started saying, yeah, in Marxist terms, I can be a subject of history, not just an object of history. And that upsurge of the late 19th and early 20th century socialist movement, there was a freshness about it, there was a newness about it, there was a real sense of hope about it. And obviously all of us wanted to recapture some of that. But we're also very aware that by the time we came along, that socialist idea wasn't new and fresh anymore. It had been, you had the collapse of the socialist movement in 1914, with people just rallying behind an awful war which they had pledged the day before to say would never happen.
Right.
You had the Bolshevik Revolution, but also an awful set of betrayals associated with the Bolshevik Revolution. And the sullying of the name of socialism in just unimaginable ways. You had the Holocaust, and
right.
just the 20th century was a tough century, and there was just to be aware of any of the history was to be aware of we're carrying a lot of baggage.
And so the rising of these new social forces almost seem like a wrecking ball and kind of a stultifying, like, I guess, a stultifying kind of, almost you could say, class order for the working class, like Meany representing sort of like a way that the working class has become like accommodated to capitalism. It almost seems like these new social forces are kind of smashing through that. And,
well, to some extent, but to some extent, the social forces smashing through, I wouldn't underestimate how much the CIO changed the way the working class related, the whole set of the working class. And of course, the CIO at the time of the AFL-CIO merger was smaller than the AFL. But what happened with the AFL, and the Machinist Union being the case I cited earlier, what happened is, I'll get more stories here, but I think it was the 1935 AFL convention, with the Committee on Industrial Organization was reporting and had been active for a while, and John Lewis was the head of the, John L. Lewis, the head of the mine workers, led that, but Sidney Hillman from the Amalgamated Clothing Textile Workers was part of it, the ILG, the textile workers. There were several unions that had been strong on an industrial union basis, advocating for more on an industrial union basis. And the craft unions continued to say, no, we don't want that. And their model really was, if you organize GM, the electricians are going to do the electrical work, and the plumbers are going to do the plumbing work, and that's the way it's going to have to go. And I guess the assembly line workers belong someplace, but we'll figure that out later. And that wasn't a model that was going to work, really, but that's the model they were stuck in. And the famous scene where Bill Hutchinson from the Carpenters stands up at the end of the debate and belittles something that John L. Lewis is saying, and Lewis is saying we're arguing about small potatoes here. Hutchinson stands up and says, I always liked small potatoes. I grew up on small potatoes, that's why I'm so small. And Hutchinson was actually bigger than Lewis, a big guy, and Lewis himself was a big guy. And Lewis hauled off and punched him and knocked him to the floor. And it became sort of the symbolic break with the old way of doing things. And within a couple of years, you had the rubber workers were actually first for the sit-down strike. The auto workers took off. The steel workers were a little bit slower, but they organized mass industries. And the AFL, which in '35 had been saying, no, that's not the way to do it. We have to organize on a craft basis. By '35, nobody was organizing on a craft basis. So the machinists decided, we're organizing Boeing. Did they just say we're going for the tool and die makers? No. They organized everybody in the plant.
Janitors.
Everybody, yeah. The plumbers, the electricians, everybody who worked there became a member of the IAM. And the IBEW, the classic craft union, if there was one, I come from Massachusetts. Raytheon came after the war, but they organized Raytheon. They didn't just say, oh, we're just getting the craft electricians here. The people who were working on the assembly line were IBEW members. So the AFL changed the way that people, changed the order of how the working class related to its own organization.
Right.
And I would not underestimate that. And in all that we were doing in terms of the new social forces and the feminist movement and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, we were also trying to continue the traditions of that kind of organization. Where you got some new organization were things like public employees. So the teachers and AFSCME, which I had mentioned, which were really fairly new formations by the time we came along.
I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up
Sure.
to the audience so that people get a chance to ask questions. You know, you talked about the importance of liberalism and kind of the struggles of progressive liberals and their relation to, I suppose, the struggle for socialism. I was reading an article that you wrote in 1981 about the Socialist International the other day. It was in, I have it written down on my computer.
It was probably in Democratic Left.
Yes, it was, number 9, Democratic Left, number 9. And in it, you kind of talk about the history of the dangers also of working with progressive liberalism. I was wondering, you know, what those dangers are and what is kind of the role or task of Marxists in the politics of socialism that might be different from that of liberals.
I don't remember what I wrote in '81. What was I saying about the
You were talking about, you know, the Socialists International and how it's kind of changing the, you know, ossified swamp of communists in Europe. And you were, I think, thinking about, my sense from the article, because a lot of it was reportage, a lot of it was just reporting on what was happening in Europe, but it seemed to me that you were thinking about the legacy of social fascism and the Popular Front in Europe, and what it had done to the communist parties there, I mean, particularly in places like France. And that when one, you know, allies themselves with progressive liberals and progressive capitalists, one risks ceding leadership to the progressives, right? Who are interested in, you know, kind of managing new ways of exploiting the working class, so that it's kind of this fine line. And I think you were trying to think about how this new group in Europe in the 80s was going to deal with that legacy. That's my sense from the article.
That's a good summary, and I'm not trying to recapture what my thoughts were back then. Yeah, I think everything you just said is right. And it's also inevitable that you're going to have to work with liberals, because that, particularly in the U.S. context. Of course, liberal in Europe has that's where, when we talk about neoliberalism, that's really a formulation from European politics, where liberal really means laissez-faire capitalist. And that's in the American context, liberal means something very, very different. Although there's some overlap with that older tradition. But yeah, I think it's inevitable that in allying with progressives who aren't socialists, there is the danger of new forms of class exploitation. But particularly in the history of what we've seen here in the States in just the last 4 or 5 awful years, but really going back at least to the Reagan administration, you really have no choice. And that the alternatives to working with progressives really look increasingly awful.
So, I mean, you know, you were just speaking, and I thought kind of rather passionately about the optimism of the socialist movements of the 19th century. And they had an independence that I think is different from what you're saying we're required to do I mean, is that lost? What do we do then with, you know, kind of the intellectual and political history of Marxism?
Yeah, well, I think there was a long-running joke that Harrington and I had, where, particularly in the youth section, we used to do these routines about always fight revisionism. And Mike would come in and say, no, always embrace revisionism. Because revisionism is what you need to do every day. You need to be rethinking and reimagining how things come together. And I think that's the task for Marxists, is to keep doing that. And particularly, and if you go back to that 19th century, part of what made that 19th century movement independent and so powerful is that 1880, 1890, 1900, it really, Marx's prediction of the working class, a unified working class that people would think of in a sense as a working class, people who are working in factories and working in construction sites, would be the overwhelming majority of the society, and they would be ready to run things. It's been a while since that's been true. And part, I don't even know if anybody could find it right now, but Mike did an analysis of that awful 1972 convention of the Socialist Party. And part of his analysis was looking at Tom Kahn's very vitriolic attack on him, which Mike made it a point not to take personally, which is very hard to do. But it came down to Kahn saying that we need to be with the working class, which means the leadership of the AFL-CIO. And Mike's analysis there was, there has been a through line that's been a problem in the socialist movement that was shared by Kautsky and Stalin and by a lot of current people, including Social Democrats USA, that there's a simplified, unified working class that's going to be our salvation. And the class structure of modern society is a lot more complicated than that. And you're going to have to think through what the social forces are and how the alliances work and how you make it to a majority that gets you to liberation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I enjoyed this, thank you.
All right, I think if you have some time, let's open
Sure.
it up to questions. I'm going to take the microphone around
Great.
because I know that
I think,
it can
as
be
I
hard.
said, I think I can.
Yeah, I think everybody can hear you, but let us know in the audience if it gets hard.
Thank you so much for your remarks. My question is to kind of bring us up to speed to the present. When you talked about the dissolution of the SPA, the Socialist Party of America, SDUSA, and the founding of DSOC, I think you used the word modest. It was a modest proposal. You had modest hopes. I wondered if we could unpack that notion. Like, what did you all think was possible? What did you think was off the table? What was the idea of what you were doing? Was it like a pre-political project or like a educational propaganda group that was not a party? And then those hopes that you had then in the 80s, or the 70s, excuse me, what became of those? Have they stuck around until the present, or have people sort of changed their visions of those? So that's sort of my question.
Okay. When I say we're modest, we were very modest. And Nixon had just won a very commanding re-election. And in his interpretation of that election, he said that he came pretty close to saying this was a repudiation of New Deal liberalism, and that we needed to move back to a much more market-oriented society and not have this nanny welfare state doing everything. So we thought we were in for a much worse period than it turned out we were in the early 70s. We thought Nixon was going to be consolidating his power. As it turned out, for his own sort of bizarre psychological dysfunctions, he pissed away his power and ended up in these paranoid fantasies, running around the White House looking for Jews and all sorts of other stuff. And the Nixon administration and the Nixon coalition in 1972 collapsed. 74 was a terrible year for Republicans, and of course 76, the Republicans were turned turned out of office. But the context, in that context, we thought we were an educational and propaganda group. We thought we were reasserting some kind of presence for American socialism, some kind of holding pattern that would be there for better times. We certainly do not see ourselves as part of it.
And then, so it would be in the 80s that the DSA comes around. How did that vision from DSOC form later projects?
Well, I think by the early 80s, the pessimism we had in the early 70s actually had come true. Because Reagan did win. He won a fairly commanding election in 1980 and won an even more commanding election in 84. And the Democrats, this is pretty well established, that if you take a look at, NPR did a recent history of neoliberalism, and if you take a look at some of what was going on, we were very actively fighting this. And we became sort of opponents of the Carter administration for this reason. Carter had actually taken some of the right turns that Reagan took further, but deregulation was a Carter move. The turn away from full employment policy was a Carter move. Repudiation of trying to do national health insurance, for which there was really broad support in the Congress and the population, was Carter. So there had already been a right turn in the Democratic Party, and the Republicans really consolidated that in the 1980s. So by the time DSA came along, I think everybody was scrambling to try to hold on, and there were movements that were very much involved in. The freeze was a very hopeful moment because you were really reaching out to people. I remember at the time talking to a lot of movement veterans saying, my God, this is somewhere you can even talk to Republicans. Because there were a lot of particularly Republican women who were horrified by the idea that the U.S. policy was nuclear annihilation, and that there were hopes to be some cracks in that. We also were involved in the anti-Reagan budget coalitions and all sorts of other things, but everybody recognized it was grim times, and everybody was hoping that better times were coming. And I think I mentioned this in the panel we had earlier. I think one of the things that all of us underestimated is just how badly the labor movement was set to go for a really massive collapse. And I know for me that I just didn't think it was going to be possible to have that level of the collapse of the organized working class, but it happened.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I guess I had a question about the value of the term democratic socialism in the 20th century, because it gets used in many different ways. And I was wondering the value of that term with respect to the history of Marxism. So Michael Remington writes this great article, Marxism and Democracy. The first sentence is, Marx and Engels are democratic socialists in the most profound sense. I've read it in this room, it's a great article. On the other hand, as Erin was mentioning, the early part of the 20th century, democratic socialism might have been seen as antagonistic to Marxism. In other words, it would have been associated with social democracy, and these are people who killed Rosa Luxemburg, something like this. And now today, democratic socialism again seems to mean something different. It's more associated with the Democratic Party. And so I was wondering how much that term, like the value of it today, what did it mean in the 20th century, and also how much it maybe kind of bared a wound of the early part of the 20th century, because you could take the sort of famous Rosa Luxemburg line about there's no democracy without socialism, there's no socialism without democracy. It would seem redundant to say I'm a democratic socialist, because it should be implied, and yet this seemed to be necessary to distinguish one as, no, I'm a democratic socialist, something else in the latter part of the 20th century. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's...
Yeah, it's clear. Or at least I think it's clear. You'll know it's clear if my answer is confused. But I think in the early part of the 20th century, the currents within social democracy were very complex and problematic. And you're right. the Social Democratic government did kill Rosa Luxemburg. There's no getting around that. But Kautsky, who lived on to the 30s, to his dying day, considered himself an orthodox Marxist and remained a leader of the Social Democratic Party. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't justify things the Social Democratic Party of Germany did, but it remained a major part of who they thought they were. So that early, I think that it's muddied there, and there was a lot of bad things, but a lot of bad things by a lot of people, right? So why, given what Rosa said, which I think is right, why do you insist on saying democratic when you say socialist? And I think it's fairly simple that the experience that millions of people have had and the experience most of the world has observed is that in the name of socialism, just awful things have been carried out. And yeah, we don't justify killing Rosa Luxemburg, but we're also not for the mass killings that Mao and Stalin carried out.
Can I just add something really quickly to that? There's this thing, relating then to the history of Trotskyism, she brought up Mack Shackman as well, that DSA has this influence of Shackmanitism, so Trotsky, and that would not associate with a later Karl Kautsky, even though Trotsky has a very nice obituary of Karl Kautsky. And also, Trotsky likes to point out that her famous interview Stalin gave in 1936, where he says, Willie Howard, we have the most democratic constitution in the world.
Right.
And so I guess, there's also this other side going into democratic socialism in the later 20th century, which would not say, yes, we've come out of Kautsky, and yet today there's this kind of neo-Kautskyism
Right.
that in the DSA. So then how does that square then?
Yeah. Well, I don't consider myself a neo-Kautsky. As indicated, Mike's analysis of the 72 convention saw Kautsky's analysis is very mechanistic. I think one of the things in the Trotskyist tradition, it's definitely there, and it's very heavily there in DSA right now. No relation to mine. Joe Clark, who was part of that Gates faction in the Communist Party, who came out of the Communist Party. He had been Moscow editor of the Daily Worker. He had been a leading communist. Came out, became part of the, I don't think he ever joined the Socialist Party, he definitely joined DSOC, and he was a dissent editor for a number of years. At one point, when I was very young and working full-time for DSOC, he and I had lunch, and he said, one of the things you need to understand is a lot of people we're dealing with come out of a Trotskyist tradition, and one of the things the Trots never understood was the race question. And it hit me, and I think he was right. And if you take a look at the practice of the Communist Party and the enormous influence they had within the black community and the real following they had, and they were sometimes seemed extreme on that, but they really did focus hard and well on the race question. And I think the Trotskyists were much less successful in doing that. And I think it remains a weakness in the larger left.
So I also have a question. I was going to ask, so it seems today, just to fast forward to the present, it seems today like this question of race, gender, class versus class, they're wielded against each other once again within the DSA. And I'm wondering if that's how do you see that? It almost seems like a recrudescence of the old debate, but then it's really kind of not. It almost just kind of looks like that. And so why is it that we kind of are falling back on that sort of framing of that issue?
I think that's a really good question, and I wish we could get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
For all the problems the AFL-CIO has right now, and it has many, the fact that Liz Schuler is now the leader of the American working class is an important development. And I think Liz, in fact, I know Liz a little bit, I don't know her well, but she would identify herself as a feminist. And I know she's in a number of both private and public conversations. She makes the point that the largest organization of women in the United States, of organized women in the United States, is the AFL-CIO. And I think there needs to be an understanding that it can be a both-and situation. That you can favor feminism, you can favor Black Lives Matter, and you can be part of pushing the working class agenda. It's unfortunate that it really is unfortunate. I think they become opposed, because I think, particularly, you just take a look at the census data. The working class is no longer, and will never again be, the middle-aged white guy with a lunch bucket going to a construction site, and it's or an even cruder version of that, the factory worker. And there are damn few factory workers left. Actually, there are more than people think there are, but they are much less organized than they used to be, much less better paid than they used to be, much more educated than they used to be. It's an ongoing task to think about and revise your understandings of what's actually going on in the society.
So Jack, just on that point, one quick follow-up. What about the kind of old Trotskyist argument that would have been made in, the 50s, but even the 60s, that, the strategy of the Communist Party in putting forth the Black Belt thesis and in working with the Black nationalists was ceding leadership of the Black sections of the working class to basically Black capitalists and Black bourgeois politicians. Do you think that that was, a mistaken point of view, or do you think that it has some credence?
I think it has some credence, and the Communist Party at least was engaging with the Black population. And it's not the Trotskyist movement didn't at all. There were some very important Black intellectuals in the Trotskyist tradition. But there wasn't the level of mass engagement that the Communist Party really succeeded in having. And for all its faults and its isolation, and A. Philip Randolph stands alone in a number of ways, but the Socialist Party did have, in ways that the Trots didn't, that engagement through Randolph, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and a level of credibility and standing in the Black community that other radicals just never had.
Hi, thank you for that interview. It was great. So I've heard mentioned an insistence on revision or on updating ideas of the left to change conditions. And I see that as connected to an insistence that the left has often on learning from and if not avoiding altogether its past mistakes. But going back to the early, late 19th and early 20th century history of socialist movements, what you could say the best radicals of that movement did, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, all of them took themselves as clarifying that by organizing independently, the working class was creating a crisis within capitalism, namely imperialism, and that crisis embodied the potential for change. But at the same time as embodying that potential for change, it also could have led to new forms of domination or really led to the potential that socialism would inherit rather than transform the capitalist state. So with that in mind, my question is there perhaps a sense in which the left views learning from its own mistakes has almost become an obstacle for the left, or this idea of not repeating the past has become an obstacle for organizing independently?
That's interesting. That's a very interesting question. I have to say, I'd never heard it posed in exactly that way, so I'm not sure what my answer is. Yeah, I think you're right that with even the best thinkers didn't really think about how you might. Luxemburg was probably better than either Lenin or Trotsky on this, because we can see the faults they had. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg never slaughtered the Kronstadt sailors, right? So it's she didn't have the problems of governing that the Bolsheviks had. Had she had that problem, I think it would have been different, because she was very insightful about dynamics within the socialist movement and things that you had to think about in terms of a new society. But it's an intriguing question about whether focusing so much on our past mistakes stops us from really doing the things we need to do now. And I don't have a good answer to that.
Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to ask, so you indicated there was a significance to the organizing committee, part of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, like that phrase. So I'm wondering how you think this spirit changed over the years. Like, was this open approach resolved somehow? Or was it perhaps falsely resolved anyway?
What do you mean by resolved?
Like, was the openness of trying to organize, of seeing yourself not as a party, but as like an attempt to organize a party, that implies a kind of openness to possibility. And I'm wondering, like, was that openness kind of foreclosed somehow?
I don't think so. I think DSA is still struggling with what all that means. But DSA certainly, when the merger happened in the early 80s, very much saw itself as not even a pre-party formation, but certainly not a party formation. And as looking for the possibilities, looking for where the openings were going to be for, in some ways, the Luxembourg moment where there'd be a mass uprising that people could relate to. But so I don't think that has been foreclosed. I think DSA right now is having some very spirited debates about, is it a pre-party formation? Is it a party? I think that is still up for grabs.
One of the things that has been sort of crucial and central to Platypus in looking at the history of the left is the concept of repetition and regression that I think Justin was touching on in his question. I wanted to read a brief piece that Harrington wrote that I think informs sort of the perspective on why DSOC was formed in the way that it was. Quote, in 1968, the center-right of Nixon and Wallace received almost 58% of the votes. In 1972, in a two-way race, Nixon got over 61%. In 1968, the American unions were a major and sometimes sole force behind Hubert Humphrey, proving that the organized workers are the most cohesive element that can be mobilized for social change. But the 1968 election also proved that labor by itself cannot come close to winning. In 1968, many McCarthyites did not understand that Humphrey was infinitely preferable to Nixon. In 1972, the Mediaites did not understand that McGovern was infinitely preferable to Nixon. If this split continues, the Republicans will hold the presidency for the foreseeable future. Therefore, the only way to build a new majority for social change is for labor and the new politics to come together. In reading that quote and in hearing your reaction to the Nixon election in particular, which sounds like it was very influential in both the crack-up of the SPA and the formation of DSOC, and subsequently how the election of Reagan in 1980 was very influential in the merging of DSOC into the DSA. I'm also struck by the fact that, in spite of the fact that Trump lost the election last year, that seems to be a similar repetition of a common theme that has been seen throughout the American left. Do you believe that the orientation toward capitalist politics, the orientation toward party politics in the US has been a necessary feature of the left, or has it impeded its ability to realize a political program that is different, given that we continue to see this same process repeated again and again? Was there a road not taken that you wish you could have taken in 72, looking back and seeing the results of the past 40 or 50 years and the transformation and change on the left that has occurred over that period?
Yeah. You're Justin?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this in some ways gets back to Justin's question about are we focused on trying to avoid the errors of the past and therefore blocked? And I would say that in 72, we had already seen the issue of party formation and where the working class aligns itself as having been resolved a generation earlier. That 38 split from the Socialist Party with the Socialist Action Caucus left en masse from the Socialist Party to say, screw you, you can't tell us we're not supporting somebody who saved us from getting slaughtered by the National Guard. The 36 election where the garment trades all aligned with Roosevelt, that the working class had already made its choice a generation earlier in terms of the Democratic Party is the vehicle through which we're operating. So by 72, we didn't really even see that as an open question. I don't know if that answers your question.
I have a follow-up, actually. From a contemporary perspective, we've seen to a significant extent, both with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan as well as the 2016 election of Donald Trump, that labor, in terms of uneducated, non-college educated labor, has swung significantly to voting for the Republicans in both of those political realignments in those elections. And it sounds like a similar dynamic occurred with the Meadyites in 72. What do you make of that movement of what had previously been the base for socialist parties in the United States, increasingly moving away from the previous New Deal alignment of working class people in American politics?
Yeah.
And secondarily, you mentioned that DSOC was based on trying to bridge a rising middle class with an organized labor force, these new social forces with previously existing organized labor. How did you draw a distinction between someone being middle class versus working class in that sense? Was it just a college education? Just from, I guess, a very strict Marxist standpoint, even if you're college educated and you're still earning a wage and you are not a holder of significant capital assets, that doesn't necessarily make you non-working class in that sense. So it's kind of a two-part question, but what do you make of the movement of the American working class and the way that it has over the past 50 years, and how do you draw the distinction between the new social forces and organized labor that was influential for DSOC?
So start with the organized working class and the drift to the right. You're absolutely right that has been a major drift. I think it's a major problem, not just for the socialist left, but for anybody who believes in survival of the planet, human decency, anything else. That we've got to figure out a way to overcome that divide. I'd also point out that if you, going back to the 70s, through the 2016 and 2020 elections, that there has been and continues to be a real distinction between organized workers and unorganized workers. That the swing of people who are union members or in union households towards the Republicans has been much less pronounced than among the unorganized. There's a very sharp distinction there, going back to Reagan but continuing through Trump.
But by the same token, in spite of Clinton's endorsement by many union organizers in the 2016 election, many union members voted for Trump both in the primaries and in general, who were part of those unions.
They did, and they voted for Trump in smaller percentages than their unorganized compatriots, significantly smaller percentages. It doesn't mean it wasn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean that's something we have to combat. But I think that the fact that union organization continues to have an influence on how people act politically. And that's something that I think needs to get built, we need to build upon. It just is. And it's, I think, stronger union organization, particularly in the South, could change how the whole society, the way the whole society looks. And I think that may, I'm optimistic, I think that may be coming. Because it just, I just do. I think the Alabama defeat, notwithstanding, I think there are indications that it will be some organizing breakthroughs, and I think it will matter. I think it's going to matter politically. On your other question, yes, people who don't actually control the means of production, in some sense, remain part of the working class. But do they think of themselves as part of the working class? I think that's a much more complicated question and a knotty question. I mean, it gets, as I said, in the debates that we had in the 70s between Social Democrats USA and us, some of this got silly because the teachers were obviously college educated, and if anybody represents that sort of new class sensibility, you know, teachers do. But they'd be marching behind Al Shanker saying we're for the traditional working class, and people used to make fun of that in terms of you see all those wrenches that the teachers bring into their classroom. So there can be a level of absurdity on some of this, but to take very contemporary examples, people who are producing social media for Google, let's say, do they see themselves as part of the working class? It's unclear. And there can be the reality of their class position, but their perception of the class position matters too. And it matters in how you talk to them, and it matters in how politics gets formed.
I have another question. So what do you make of, so let me start at the beginning. So it seems like leading into the 70s, you talk about, I guess you said the new rising class, right, is kind of identified with the new social forces. What do you think, you know, in light of subsequent history where it almost seems like that rising class has become the risen class of the newly kind of educated, multiracial, multi-gendered, upper working class? What is the continued purchase of, say, things like Me Too, Black Lives Matter? Like, I almost think of the way that the other Justin talks about how we change conditions into the old terms that we tend to fit them into, and has the risen class become, in some sense, is there a need to reformulate their demands into a different dimension? It almost seems like we keep them in the terms that we kept them in the 70s, that we talk about, you know, gender, race. Is there a need to continue to leave those categories alone, or does it seem like they've changed substantially in reality? Like, have they really, can we not think about them anymore in terms of the old
I think we need
boxes?
to keep. I think we need to keep thinking about it. And I think it's again a matter of ongoing understanding, struggle. And let me take a different one that we haven't talked about so far: gay rights,
right? Yeah. Gender,
which
sexuality.
which would broadly part of gender, but. My friends from SD USA would tell me this is scurrilous, but I think it's not. I think it's absolutely demonstrably true. Tom Kahn was an open homosexual. And he and By Rustin were actually lovers at the time of the 1963 March on Washington. Tom Kahn became a speechwriter for George Meany. Meany at the, and I remember this very vividly because it's a play on my name. Meany at the Steelworkers Convention, where it became really important for him to have the steelworkers hold the line on neutrality, because if the steelworkers broke, it could look like all of the old CIO was against them, and he had people like the machinists and the communications workers who were also against them, and it was going to be really important. So Meany went all out at that Steelworkers Convention to convince them that they were against an endorsement of Montgomery. And in the speech, he said, why did we object to the 1972 convention? What was wrong with it? And his answer, his rhetorical question he answered was, there were too many people there who looked like Jacks, acted like Jills, and smelled like Johns. Tom Kahn wrote that speech. It is unimaginable now that any gay person would ever engage in that kind of slur. It's also unimaginable that the leader of the AFL-CIO would stand up with that kind of openly taunting homophobic remark. For all the problems we faced in the last 50 years, in my entire adult lifetime now, and the collapse of the organized working class, the rise of an absolute abhorrent right and everything else, the fact that we've made that kind of progress, where Pride at Work exists as an organization affiliated with the AFL-CIO, that Liz Schuler identifies as a feminist and says that the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO is a longtime black civil rights activist. The struggles of those new, what I had been calling new and emerging, the struggles, they have redefined the way we think about things, the way we talk about things. I think those are important historic gains, and we need to continue working on it. And I think in real life, getting to sort of the hard reality of class struggle and everything else, something like the Me Too movement has meant that women have just got another tool to say to the boss, no, you can't do that. It's an important, these are really important things, and you can't just submerge them into, it's all the class struggle.
Okay, we've had a wide-ranging discussion and we're drawing to the end. We do have a bit more time, and since I've been taking the microphone around everywhere, I'm going to use my privilege to ask one final question, which is that, earlier, Jack, you mentioned that in the time of, the late 19th century, early 20th century, it appeared as though there was a kind of unified working class that was the majority of society that was going to make a revolution, and that we haven't had that for a very long time. At the same time, you did kind of note that maybe there are some things that we can learn from the revolutionaries of that period. And you expressed a preference, I believe, for Rosa Luxemburg. I was wondering, what it is about Rosa Luxemburg's ideas that you think are kind of more applicable to the present, or that we need to learn from, particularly in comparison to her peers, like Lenin, or Trotsky, and not Kronstadt, but maybe about the ideas, and because we've all heard of like the horrors of history. And then I also just wanted to say that this is a room of mostly undergraduate students who have been reading Marx and Engels. They're going to read Lenin, Luxemburg, maybe even some Trotsky, who knows. They're interested in Marxism and revolution and socialism and all these sorts of things. And if there was one thing that you thought we should learn from your experience on the left, and particularly the experience you've told us about today in the Socialist Party and around the founding of DSOC and the McGovern campaign, that you think you would like to impress upon us, I would just like to invite you to share that.
Thank you. As I said, Luxembourg, aside from the ideas, Luxembourg has the advantage of never having had to wield state power, and therefore doesn't have that kind of mixed legacy. But even on the ideas, Rosa Luxemburg was extremely critical of the whole concept of the vanguard party, and stated accurately that if the party states itself as it's the vanguard of the working class, substituting for the working class, it's a logical progression to end up with a dictator substituting for the party. And it's her ideas, she was unflinchingly democratic in her ideas, and she just was. She also was brilliant, and I think the Junius brochure, if you haven't read it, read it. It's one of the things that Mike Erin urged me to read when I was very young, and it's not quick going. It's dense, but her analysis really was that the problem had become that imperialism had become so pervasive that it wasn't just reaching around the world, it was reaching back into Europe. And that's how World War I was starting. That the great powers weren't just fighting in Africa anymore, they were coming at each other at home. And that's a vast simplification of what she says, but it's really brilliant stuff. But Lenin, Trotsky, absolutely. I think it's important to read and absorb all of it, and you should be critical readers in looking at it. But yeah, Trotsky obviously, once he was out of power, was a brilliant thinker and strategist. It's for the sectarianism and everything else that he could have, he understood clearly in the early 1930s that the working class had to be united, that the Social Democrats and Communists had to get over themselves and figure out how they came together against Hitler. And had he been in power, history might have been different. So yeah, it's worth, all of that is worth reading. In terms of the long run of what's worth learning here, it's a good question. It's, I think, as much as I just talked somewhat animatedly about learning from Me Too, learning from Black Lives Matter, learning from the gay rights movement, that hasn't been my strength. My orientation and my upbringing in the movement was very much, I was shaped by a lot of those Shackmanite types who, sort of rough, prioritize the working class and all that kind of stuff. And in DSOC and later in DSA, some of the struggles we had around things like just being decent to each other and not acting as though the person you're disagreeing with in the moment is your class enemy. Keep that in mind.
All right, thank you so much.